Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Fine is a Four-Letter Word. My guest today is Dr. Liz DuBois. Welcome
Hi,
to the
thanks for
show.
having me.
My pleasure. Well, let's jump right in here and start with what were the the values and beliefs that you were raised with that contributed to you becoming who
Oh
you
gosh.
became as a young adult?
I think that there's a couple of key ones that really informed who I became. My parents are both really good people, kind people, um, good heads on their shoulders, and raised me with I want to say a keen eye towards just being a good person, right? And especially my mom was really invested in building community. She's like the kind of person that can walk into the grocery store and walk out with a best friend. There's just no one that is not a potential new person to be friends with. And I think that that really informed my worldview as far as a willingness to trust people, an eagerness to know people, desire to be part of a community. I think that was a really foundational kind of mindset that set me up for where I am today and the things that I take part in. But the more pointed answer to that, I think, is that there were a lot of different values that I grew up with as a young adult that really informed who I didn't want to be. And I think that those things were just as fundamental, if not more so, than the kind of, squishy, everyone everyone is someone to love, and there's no such thing as a stranger, just a friend you haven't met yet, things like that. When I was 8, my mom and dad went through a divorce, and my mom, out of very good intentions, brought us to a church and said, this is kind of a place that we can find community and support. And I don't think that there was any abject religious overtone to her decision to do that. I really think it was, this is a place where people quite literally congregate, and will be able to find warm-hearted, open people that can be supportive. Within that church, however, and this was not just within that church, but within kind of the broader culture of Christianity in the Midwest and the South in this period of time, there was a kind of rampant movement called non-denominationalism. And even though this was a Methodist church that we were involved in, the youth leaders in the youth group were deeply entrenched in kind of Southern Baptist, born-again Christian values and culture. And I grew up surrounded by, my youth group was really foundational. I was a very big nerd. I didn't have I didn't have a huge network of friends.
Weren't we
Oh
all,
man,
though?
I mean, I really, I was outspoken. I was very tall. I was chubby. I'm 5'11". I've been this tall since I was 12. I just like, it felt really awkward all the time. And my youth group was a safe haven for me, but it came with the price tag of being inculcated with a lot of values that were anti-LGBTQ, anti-abortion, anti-women, anti-women's bodies, anti-dating. This concept of, there was a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye that was published by a young man named Joshua Harris. And so there was this overarching concept of sex is something that you have when you're married. Dating is sinful because it could lead to premarital sex, so you should be courting, meaning any relationship that you have should have a keen eye towards marriage. Any relationship that doesn't end in marriage is kind of a failed relationship, meaning you better get it right from the start, or else there's something wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
Your picker is wrong. So all of those kind
Okay.
of, that zeitgeist of fundamentalism really baked into, I think, a very problematic worldview for me. I've known since I was 8 that I liked girls and had crushes on girls. When I was 13, I remember sitting in a bunk in church camp, going through this like Bible study workbook, and it said, check the boxes of all the ways that you've sinned in your heart. And one of them was like, you're attracted to to people of your own sex. I don't even think the concept of gender had kind of migrated into this founding fundamentalist movement.
Sure, right. Back then, nobody
And
was talking about
so
that.
I remember looking at that worksheet, and I was 13. Like I like talking about it, I can put myself back in that bunk bed, like sitting, looking at that worksheet, and I was just like, I'm making a choice. This is not part of my life. This is not something that I am. This is like this door is closed.
So like you cut part of yourself off.
Absolutely. And so started getting into really tumultuous relationships with boys. And I'm not saying men on purpose, because I was 15, 16, and in addition to the church kind of indoctrination, where I grew up in Southern Ohio, there was abstinence only education, and that was in parts of the country now that's still considered acceptable. So there was no conversation of consent, no discussions of kind of healthy boundaries in relationships, how to talk about sex, because sex was something that you just don't have. And so the first time that I had quote unquote sex, right, I don't think of it as sex because it was non-consensual. The first time that I had intercourse, it was non-consensual, because I didn't have the language to say, these are the things that I'm comfortable with, these are the things that I'm not. And after that experience, I was still surrounded by all of this abstinence only malarkey, and didn't really have anyone to go to in my like tribe to say, no adults to go to and be like, this just happened to me, and I don't know how I feel about it, and I don't know what to do about it, because everyone around me said, if you're not a virgin, you're going to hell. And so I carried this very deep wound with me. I stayed in that relationship for 9 months, being abused, being assaulted, locking my doors because he would come bang on the windows and like scream.
How old was that? You had told me you were 15.
16.
How old was he?
16. And
okay. And was he part?
He was
part of your church.
Although he came to a lot of youth group stuff with me, like Christian rock festivals, like Ichthus, and to some extent he was a victim as well, right? Like none of these are conversations that people were being raised with if they were in these kind of more conservative circles. And so your original question was what kind of values inform who you are now. I am an ardent feminist. I have raised my son from day one. Anytime I say no, it's followed with like, no means no. Like if he asks again, I'm like, no, like there's no conversations. He's about to turn 8. He has an older stepbrother who's, through no fault of his own, like he's being exposed to a lot of older kid concepts through Kids on the Bus and through his stepbrother who's very sweet kid. Okay. So even with my 8-year-old, we're having lots of conversations about sex and about consent. Things that
well, when you start early, it makes it like it's just a natural conversation, just as if you would have a conversation about anything else. So then it becomes okay to talk about it.
And talk about it, he does, man. Like he's got all sorts of questions, and it makes me really, I just have like a profound sense of gratitude, because he understands on a fundamental level. Like he doesn't get a lot of things, but that we don't touch other people's bodies without asking, and he, when he has impulse control issues around that, there's conversations that specifically talk about consent, right? Where we're sitting him down, me, his stepmom and his dad, we're sitting him down and saying, this is why we don't touch people's bodies. This is how we treat people with respect. And so, right now we're going through, I think, as a nation, a very pointed moment around women's bodies and consent. And for me, I no longer engage in political discussions. I used to be a political advocate. I ran nonprofits that were advocacy focused. And the conclusion that I've come to at this moment in my life is my work is really to heal individual hearts so that they can go do the work that they're here to do, as opposed to scream on the steps of the State House of Maryland.
Yeah. It's so interesting how, these things that you talked about, how you were raised, the beliefs, the values that were instilled in you that are
Mm-hmm.
seemingly negative, didn't, contributed to some, what's the word I'm looking for? Some experiences that you maybe
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have wanted to go through, are now informing how you're raising your child in a
Yeah,
positive
well, I
way.
think there was a positive impact even before that. One of the defining characteristics that makes me me is a capability to pivot quite quickly from shitty thing that happened into good thing that I can use, like build service from. So when I was doing my PhD, I founded with a colleague the Center for the Study of Gender and Conflict at the Carter School of Peace Building at George Mason, that became, an international research center that drew students and scholars from around the world to collaborate on different aspects of gender-based violence research. I got to, I've published that work, some of my own work from studying in Moscow and Cambodia and Indonesia, looking at policies around safety and gender-based violence. So I think when we give ourselves permission to say, I'm going to go into my own pain really deeply and investigate what what gems are among the shit, so that I can take them and do something with them, as opposed to just kind of carry this tucked away in my heart, never to be seen again. There's so much richness to
Yeah.
be gained in that inquiry process.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Talk a little bit about that journey, because I'm curious, how did you go from where
Mm-hmm.
as this young adult in this situation, toxic situation, to someone who's starting, a program on trauma and gender-based
Yeah,
discrimination,
yeah,
study
less
about that.
it was a it was we called it a think tank slash do tank, right? It was an international research center, so we had programming, but it was an institution. So okay, the journey there. After I was assaulted and then stayed in that relationship, uh, I gained a lot of weight very quickly, to pad myself from being seen as attractive.
Sure,
Right,
as a
exactly.
protective measure.
And I don't think I had a clear idea that my desire to get out of Ohio, which is where I grew up, was driven by a desire to get away from the culture of Ohio. To some extent, perhaps.
Hmm.
Yeah. I don't know. But the second I yeah,
In
so
hindsight.
I turned 18 on September 30th, and on January 15th ish. So, like, what is that, like 10 weeks later? Yeah, not
Three
even.
months.
I was
Yeah.
in my car on my way to Orlando to do the Walt Disney World College program. I was like, I'm out of here, peeling rubber, like going somewhere bigger.
Yeah.
I had this thing that I would tell to people as I was talking about, I want to move to Washington D.C. I want to do the Disney College program. I want to be somewhere bigger than this. I kept saying I want to go where everyone is different, so no one is different. Just this like fundamental concept of diversity in
Hmm.
every sense of the word, where different languages, different races, different cultures, different viewpoints. There was just this like deep yearning desire within me, and I think a knowing that the second I got around people that weren't all the same, I would find a sense of being okay with myself.
How did you know those people existed, or that
Yeah,
those
my
places
well, my mom
existed?
grew up in New York, and I don't think ever considered herself
Okay.
someone to be from Ohio. Um, and I don't know, we didn't really travel a ton. We went to Walt Disney World a lot. I was just a big reader. I was a big reader
Okay.
and believed fundamentally that there were places where it was cool to be smart. And that was certainly not my experience. There was a beautiful woman that that now also lives in Washington, D.C., also has a PhD. She was in my class, my graduating class. She ended up leaving our school district in ninth grade, I believe, eighth or ninth grade. She won a distinction from the president for her test scores on some sort of nationalized standardized test. And they threw an assembly for her because this was such a big deal, nationally recognized as someone who had academic talent.
Okay.
And in the back of the auditorium, there were a couple of asshole kids whose names I'd really like to drop here, but I'm choosing not to. Uh,
They probably don't listen.
Sat in the back of the auditorium and went, loser, loser. And the
Right.
like kids are assholes everywhere, but the administration didn't shut them down. And there was an element of, wink, wink, nod, nod towards people being absolute fucking dicks, like specifically around women and education and excellence and things like that. And so this woman's, at the time a girl, her mom pulled up and took her, de-enrolled her, what's it called? Took her out of the school system. Unenrolled, disenrolled,
Unenrolled?
something. She
Yeah.
took her out, right? And put her in private school because, oh my God, are you kidding me? There was just such a
Right. Right.
fundamental like sense of we don't have to care about being intelligent, and people that are like that, like are losers, right? Like this element of like not even,
Right.
like nerds do nerd things, but that the people who are wildly intelligent, that's some sort of mark against them, as opposed to like, thank God we have clean drinking water and like bridges that work because people are,
Yeah.
environmental scientists and engineers.
Right. 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 That people got educated enough to do that. Yeah. Okay. So
Got
you
out.
got out and went to
Greener
greener
pastures, yes.
pastures.
Yeah, I went to American University for
Okay.
undergrad, and all of a sudden I was surrounded. Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So
yeah,
did
yeah. I
I.
forgot that we're both alumni. So no, right? Like there's a very distinct
Right.
flavor of like activism laden, nerdy, smart, committed to changing things, right?
And definitely, right. And definitely a
Yes.
culture of diversity. All kinds of people from different nationalities, different everything. I mean, anything you want to find,
Yep,
you can find there.
absolutely. It was so liberating. And it's funny, after I finished my PhD, I taught at both GW, I taught at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and I taught at American University School of International Service. And, both of these schools draw cream of the crop students, right? They're so smart, so funny, so
Right.
driven. There is a absolute distinct flavor of student at American University that they're just like, we're going to found NGOs, we're going to change the world, everything is going to be different because I'm going to step up to the plate and make a difference. And it was such a fun environment to be around as a professor, and just like see these these young people just like wildly bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and like ready to go, and it was really fun to be reminded of just where I had been at that 20 years earlier phase of my life.
Yeah. 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 Very cool. So, so where was the point where everything was fine but not
Fine, but
fine?
not fine.
Was that when before you left Ohio? Is that where you would
Can
consider
you
that
say fine but
fine
not fine?
piece, or was there later?
So I'll like the I'm gonna give the I'm not gonna give the all of the details answer because my ex-husband is involved in the stories, and so I'll just say my marriage turned very rocky when right after we had a miscarriage. So we had one child in 2014, and then in 2017 we lost a baby, and it was and continues to be devastating for both of us. It's still a thing that has influenced, I think,
Sure.
a lot of who we
Of
are.
course.
But after that, our marriage that had been rocky for quite some time became really combative and just untenable. And after kind of a final blowout fight, I just like I felt so strongly the presence of a divine kind of guiding spirit. Despite my awful experiences in the church growing up, I have a very close relationship with a higher power. I'm in recovery. And, from the age of 22, God has been a big part of my life. And I just felt in the midst of that blowout fight, just very, very, very clear that the path I was on was not the path that I was supposed to be on, that all of the love in my heart that I had was being poured into something that was no longer functional. And I made a decision, after 3 years of mulling about what to do, in that moment, just felt a profound sense of clarity and peace. And that was a Thursday, and on Monday I left. And it was really hard, but it also, fine but not fine. We had matching BMW convertibles, Mini Coopers, matching Mini Cooper convertibles. We had a beautiful 1851 row home that I had restored. I general contracted the renovation and had won a historic architecture preservation award for. We had a beautiful child. My now ex-husband owned and continues to own his own law firm. I was the executive director of a nonprofit membership organization of 5,000 people. So on the outside, right, like we have, he owns a law firm. I run a prestigious organization. We have, beautiful cars. We have a beautiful child. We have a beautiful house. We have all the things, but the foundational structure of that had eroded. And so, the kind of fine but not fine, I would say that was the beginning of the end. And then the end of the end, the end of the beginning of the end. I don't know. There's a line in the big book, which is the kind of like foundational text of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's this line that says, we walked through, I'm butchering it. Somebody's going to correct me here. But it was okay. like we walked through the archway towards freedom, and that moment where I felt like I really was walking through the archway towards a new life was I was still very early in the divorce process. I think we'd probably been separated maybe 3 weeks, maybe. And I was at a casino restaurant opening in downtown Baltimore at the Horseshoe Casino, and I was running an educational equity nonprofit, and the casino had been built with taxpayer dollars based on the premise that the part of the proceeds would go back into education, and of course they hadn't. And so now we're advocating to like fix this loophole that this slimy organization had brokered. And so I'm going to this place with a donor who I'm courting the donor to give me a donation. So I'm going to a place that I'm advocating against at a state level, but I'm going to go there dressed up and pretend that I'm okay with it. And the mayor is going to be there. And the Mayor Catherine Pugh, who later went to jail for corruption, mayor is someone that I believe vehemently is terrible at her job and doing a bad job for the city. So now I'm with a donor who's wonderful, in a casino that I'm fighting against with a mayor that I believe is fundamentally corrupt. And the donor is talking to me about how to pour the perfect Kir Royale, like this cocktail. And so I'm sitting here nodding along and smiling. Meanwhile, I've been...
There's everything wrong with this situation. So my last drink
had been in, thank you God, had been in August 2006, continues to have been in August 26, 2006. So I haven't had a drink since August 2006. I'm here trying to play nice with a donor who's explaining to me how to have the perfect cocktail, and I'm nodding along saying, oh my gosh, that sounds delicious. Doesn't sound delicious, sounds like poison. like I'm gonna drink that.
Right.
So you're doing that, and then here comes the mayor, may she rot in peace. And so she kind of like stumbles over to us, and she walks like a bird. And so she comes over to us and she goes, oh, it's so nice to see you. And the donor and I like turn to each other and we're like, oh my God, I hate her. And then here she comes, Mayor Pugh. And we go, oh my gosh, so nice to see you. How are you, Elizabeth? How are you, donor? And I'm just like
Wow.
here being fake to a donor, being fake to the mayor in a building built like on a premise that I find wholly irresponsible, that I think is exploitative. And at that moment, a friend from grad school had moved in with me for a little while to help me just through the transition of this early divorce. And she texts me, and my geriatric Labrador had peed on her bed. And I just had this moment where Mormons who leave the church, they call it the shelf broke, right? All these little things that they're not okay with, that they just mentally like put on a shelf. Like the shelf eventually breaks, like the shelf broke.
Yeah.
I was like, you know what? I'm being fake with the alcohol. I'm being fake with the fun, like I'm being fake to the mayor's face. Like I fundamentally disagree with this building and everything it stands for. And now my, 14-year-old Labrador is peeing on somebody's bed. I just can't. And then the organization was going through financial struggle, and it was really a question mark as to whether or not we'd make salary over the next couple of weeks. And the next day I was like, I can't. I went to the board and I was like, there's no money. Like, there's no, I don't have the capacity to do this. And I don't know what to do, because I don't see a solution financially. I'm not in a place in my life where I can be the person that solves this problem. And it was so difficult to admit to people I really respected, that I'm over my head. I'm not, like, I can't raise money right now. I'm fundamentally not in a position to solve a very real problem that this organization has, that I can't. And I think for high performers, we have a very real tendency to believe that if we step aside from the things that are no longer tenable, that the whole world will end. And my world changed profoundly, but it didn't end.
That's a really heavy burden to carry, to think that the success of an entire organization is dependent on one person.
And it wasn't.
Or the success of
I don't want to.
Right, but I'm saying you mentioned how high achievers think that, and we carry this, and yet it is not true. So it's a story that people tell themselves that they are so necessary, and not from an egotistical place necessarily. It's from I truly believe that what I'm doing is so important that I'm afraid that things, we carry this burden.
My roommate.
And that's, you stepped aside and the organization
It continues to do great work. They've implemented some changes that I had really hoped would come to fruition. And, they continue to do great work. And that was always going to be the case, because there were always talented and invested people involved. I think the challenge when we think about leaders, which is who I work with now, I work with leaders, we get into this place where we believe so thoroughly in the mission that we tend to expend our energy in ways that actually aren't necessarily helpful to moving the needle. We just spin our wheels, hoping that the energy and momentum is eventually going to overcome fundamental structural issues. And if you can't step away and say, okay, where am I contributing to the problem here? And how do I bring in outsider perspective to help identify, the things that I don't know that I don't know? When you have humility and grace and coaches available to you that can help you do that, I think things can change pretty quickly. And I had an executive coach at the time, and I think that made a huge difference as to whether or not I was able to step aside as gracefully as possible and just say, I'm over my head here.
Yeah. When we talked in our first conversation, we talked a little bit about the difference. Just looking at my notes here, and Greg can cut this part out. The difference between mental health and mindfulness coaching.
Um,
Yeah.
can you give me a couple more hints?
We, yes, let me look over here. Uh, all right, I had, so this is interesting. We'll cut this part out, but I had notes and our conversation hasn't, it's so
Yeah.
interesting when we get to hear where the conversations go when we're actually having them
Yeah.
differently than what we had originally talked about. So we were talking, I just have a note here that says mental health versus mindfulness coaching, but also the intersection between addiction
Okay.
and high performance that we were going to talk about. So maybe we could
Yeah. So
step there for a
let's talk about
moment.
it as mindset coaching. I think that was mindfulness coaching. I'm like, I don't know
Okay.
if I do that, but mindset, probably. I think so.
Okay. So yeah. All right. So let's talk about the difference between mental health and mindset
Okay.
coaching.
Can you ask a specific question?
Or do you want to talk, or do you, okay, I was going to say, or do you want to talk about the high achievers,
An addiction?
the,
Let's do mental
yeah,
health and then kind of like let it spiral into addiction. How does that sound?
that sounds good. Yeah, we don't have a lot of time, but we could have
Okay,
like 5 minutes
cool.
on this.
So I think
Yeah.
it's really go ahead.
Oh, I was going to step back and
Good.
introduce a question to take it into it. So one of the things that we had talked about in our conversation before we started recording was this intersection between high achievers and addiction. And so I'm wondering if you could address that for a moment. And then I have another question that has been floating through my head since
Okay,
a
cool.
few minutes ago.
So
But let's do this
sounds
one
good.
first.
There's a big overlap between addicts and addiction and high performers. Many high performers have addictive personalities. It's one of the things that I think, and I'm sorry, I don't have statistics on this, but it's one of the
We don't
who
need
cares?
statistics.
I'm a qualitative researcher, not a quantitative one.
99.5% of
There you
statistics
go.
are
That's
made
what
up
Abraham
anyway.
Lincoln said on the internet. So
That's
the
right.
fundamental driving characteristic of an addict, right, is that they want more. They want more drugs, more sex, they want more food, they want more attention, they want more love, they want more cocaine, whatever it is. Oftentimes when someone gets into recovery and they put down for me, sugar and flour, that was my first entree into the 12-step world. I put down sugar and flour, and all of a sudden my spending got really out of control, right? Like I was buying things, and because I was still looking for that high, right? That dopamine.
It's like that
Exactly.
whack-a-mole thing where you beat down one mole and
That is
another one
that is
pops
the
up.
metaphor
Yeah.
that I use. Exactly. It's whack-a-mole because what your brain is trying to do, right? Addiction is not I'm addicted to X substance or X behavior. It is a pattern of how your brain is wired, right? It's seeking a dopamine hit. And in the 12-step world, we often talk about this as like a God-shaped hole. Like we're trying to fill something that only a spiritual connection can fill. But from a brain standpoint, right, it's that your brain is looking for a hit. It's looking for a high. And so for a lot of overachievers, for a lot of driven people, for a lot of leaders, that hit and that high can come from performance, and it can come from achievement, and it can come from accolades, and it can come from achieving big goals, right? So if you've been I'll use my dad as an example. He worked for General Electric for many years, and he talked about a project, and he's going to listen to this and be like, no, he got the something wrong. But he talked about this massive project of bringing electricity into an underdeveloped area. And they'd been working on it for, you know, a really, really, really long time. And they flipped the switch and all of a sudden there's electricity. And he said, I fell to my knees on the ground, overwhelmed with the emotion of seeing this thing come to life and the magnitude of how people's lives were going to change because of what we had done. Right. And that sort of validation and joy and satisfaction and just like, oh man, I can't believe we did it. Right. Like that's intoxicating. And so people that have addictive personalities
Yes.
will chase that high in different ways. Right. We'll work 20 hours eating Chinese food and, you know, like takeout and whatnot while we work to get a brief done, and then we turn in the thing and then we feel good about ourselves, but then we've got to be on to the next thing. Right. One of my clients, we talk about like achievement was her love language, right? Where it was like she'd do the
Yeah.
thing.
Right. Right. Because your belief is that simply being is not enough. Your value is based on achievement.
Exactly. You're only worthy. So there's the belief system and then there's the brain chemistry. The belief is I'm only good enough if someone is externally validating me. The brain chemistry is when I am externally validated, I get a dopamine hit. And so we can talk as a field all we want about mindset and limiting beliefs and blah, 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 blah. But when we allow ourselves to become curious about what the brain structural aspects of that are, we're able to do much more powerful work. I want to then pivot us into speaking a bit about mental health writ large here, because I think that it's really important for practitioners like me who are coaches to understand that there are moments where you need to have the humility and grace to recognize that you're out ahead of your skis. When I have a client and I'm 3 sessions
Right.
in and I'm not seeing movement and I'm starting to see patterns of behavior differently than they presented in a discovery call, I hit pause, not on our work together, but that session then becomes about finding a practitioner that can do some screening work with them, a psychiatrist that can jump in and be, you know, on the team, so that we're moving forward in a way where we're addressing whatever underlying issues there are. And I think we can get tripped up, especially I'm going to go even further with the coaching, you know, not just as mindset coaches, but when we get into kind of the spiritual woo-woo coaching where people are like, you know, I'm drawing from the Akashic records and blah, 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 which I'm down with all of it. That's fine. We can get into this very shamey, ill-informed place. We're like, well, you know, if you just ground deeper into the truth of who you are, then this won't be a thing. And,
Right.
you know, I'm pretty deeply grounded into the truth of who I am. But I also have bipolar disorder, which I address as a medical condition. It's more deadly than breast cancer and testicular cancer combined. And so I don't fuck around with it, you know? And I spiritual
Wow.
healers and teachers and mindset coaches
Yeah.
and all of that. And I also work closely with the medical team.
Right. I love that you're saying this because it isn't one size fits all or one method of development, self-development fits all. It's a combination. It's finding what works for you as an individual, and then potentially it's not just that one thing. It's this combination, like you're
It should be
talking
a
about.
well-balanced diet. You know, I think the thing that changed my life the most was when I stopped seeing my work and my achievements as the thing, as like, this is the most important thing. When I look at my calendar, the most important thing that I do is I go to work and I do the things. And I started to say, when I look at my calendar, the most important thing is my spiritual development, my mental health, and my pursuit of joy, right? So whether that's taking a walk, going for a bike ride,
Yes.
my you know, I live on an island in the Chesapeake Bay, so we go fishing a lot, we go boating, and work is so, you know, like those moments of like on your knees joy that I spoke about with my father. I get to have at least once a month a feeling like that. I get to work with incredible people who make incredible strides, who, come to me feeling very rudderless as far as their direction, and to see people move in a direction of understanding that they can have whatever they want whenever they want it because they're worthy of it. At least once a month I'm in tears during a session, just kind of like holding space and witnessing someone grow. That is not the thing that gives me the most joy, though. And I think before I had that shelf breaking moment, if you had asked like what's the thing that's the biggest priority in your life, I would have said, my son, and then I would follow that with, the work that I do. And now I would say like the work that I do is a huge source of joy. It's a reason that I'm on the planet, but when I look at my calendar, it's not the most time consuming thing. It's scattered within going on dates with cute people and, all sorts of fun stuff with my son, and going to the water every morning. I make coffee and then go to the water, and just kind of hang out with the universe and,
Yeah. And enjoying the beauty of the universe. I love it. Okay. I have my one final question, but before I ask you that question, I have to ask this because it's been on my mind, because at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about being shamed or feeling shame around the whole idea of liking girls. And then you mentioned being married to a man.
Yeah, that was an adventure.
So, okay. So you broke out of the closed-mindedness of Ohio and came to diversity, and that, like, I'm confused. That's all. I feel like I have to ask that totally question fair. Of how totally that fair. Happened.
So I'm bisexual. After my marriage ended, and me being bisexual played a fairly significant role in my marriage ending. I'll kind of leave it at that. After my marriage ended, I got into another relationship with a man, but we walked in the doors of that relationship with the clarity that I'm bisexual, and that's a non-negotiable aspect of who I am. And that's not to say my ex-husband is not tremendously supportive. He is. So in the context of that next relationship, that person really created a lot of structure for me to grow in my own understanding of who I was sexually. And that was really healing and powerful. And after I ended that relationship, I thought I was a lesbian. I came out of the relationship and I did a lot of prayer and soul searching and sat on a lot of girlfriend in the platonic sense, floors of their living room crying and saying, I think I'm gay and I don't know what to do. And I eventually came out. I came out as a lesbian and stayed single on purpose for about a year. And then when I started dating again, I'm ready to date and ready to meet my person and all of that, I realized I was still attracted to men. So I kind of walked it back and it was like, you know what? Still bisexual, turns out.
Okay. No, all good. I just felt like there was that question, and if I had that question, then my listeners are going to have that question. I had to ask you.
So I think the answer.
Okay. All right. So now let's get to
I just want to say, to anyone listening to this that grew up in kind of a conservative culture and is still deprogramming from that, or hasn't even considered the possibility of deprogramming from that, it's a spectrum and it's fine. Come out of the closet, go back to recognizing you're bisexual. At the end of the day, your sexuality is the business of you and the person you're in a relationship with. And even then, it's not really their business beyond how they're going to support you. And so I think, after I came out as a lesbian and then kind of had a moment of revision, I spent a lot of time talking to my friends that were gay and or continue to be gay, my friends that are lesbians, my friends that are gay. And every single one of them was just like, this is a thing that is a spectrum. And, you know, like one day what feels true might not feel true the next day. And that doesn't make the statement that you proclaimed any less valid. And so I think there's been different seasons and different flavors of who I'm always attracted to categorically. And, you know, and it's all fine.
Yeah. I mean, life overall is very fluid. And that's what we need to accept and recognize, circling back to the whole basis of this conversation of diversity and acceptance of all different kinds.
Absolutely.
And that again, we are not one thing all the time.
No, but I absolutely went into that straight marriage in part to, I don't want to say atone for the fact that I had feelings towards women, but it was kind of like, now I'm legit. I got married. See, I got married, and therefore, you know, and there was no one I was proving that to except myself. But I definitely felt a huge kind of societal pressure to get married, but that was less to do with my sexuality and more to do with my legitimacy as a woman. You know, like you're a real, like,
gotcha.
Like a man wants you and therefore you're worthy. And we, you know, like basic kind of like Judith Butler, you know, third wave feminism through the male gaze, you know, like I am now enough because a dude put a ring on it and now I'm ready to roll. And so kind of like taking myself off that conveyor belt and being like, never mind.
Yeah. Wow. So this conversation has been all over the place and all good stuff. Thank you so much. Now it comes to the last question of what is the song that you listen to when you need to get a boost of energy?
Mama Cass. Yeah,
what
Mama
is your
Cass,
hype song?
Make your own kind of music. 24/7, man.
Love it. All right. We will put a link to that in the show notes if people want to listen. And how can they find you if they want to continue this conversation with you?
The quickest way is to send me a DM. And I'm on Instagram as Soul, SOUL, period, Dr. DR, period, Liz, LIZ. You can go to my website, souldrliz.com, no periods in between. Or you can find me on Facebook, which is where I put most of my content. It's just Elizabeth, and then my middle name, DEGI, and my last name, DuBois, DUBOIS. You can find me on all those places.
Cool. And I will put links to those places in the show notes as well. Thanks so much for joining me today, Dr. Liz DuBois, on Fine is a four-letter word.
Having me.